All right, we're looking at the progressive era today, and talking about really what changes took place in the cities because of industrialization, and then the reform movements that are really kind of a continuation off of some of the questions that were taking place during the Gilded Age. So we talked about and looked at, like, not only social Darwinism, but the gospel of wealth, the social gospel, progress and poverty. And so you already had some of those questions taking place during the Gilded Age with looking at the poor and challenging kind of the traditional view of social Darwinism. And the progressive era is when a lot of this stuff actually gets put into action. There's going to be reform movements for the poor, and reform movements for the city, reform movements for government structure. So it's a combination of both the rapid growth and structure that takes place that really puts the cities into a rough situation, and then the reform movements that come from that, along with, of course, women's roles in the progressive era, which were massive and had a huge role in shaping a lot of this reform movement and practical application of that. So that's what we're kind of looking at today. During the progressive era, the other thing I will mention is that during the progressive era is definitely a huge push for women's suffrage. We're going to look at that, though, after World War One, because the suffrage movement spans the progressive era and then in the beginnings of World War One. So I decided that we were just going to look at that as its own separate lecture after we talk about World War One. So I did not intentionally ignore it. We will definitely be coming back to that and kind of looking at the whole process rather than trying to break it up into talking about it here and then talking about it in World War One and then talking about it at the beginning of the 1920s too. So we're just gonna have it be its whole thing, and that way we cover that span. So we'll kind of be going back to the progressive era slightly to talk about the suffrage movement, but then it's going to continue to expand through World War One and the beginning of the 1920s. All right, so start of the progressive reform era, and what were the things that were taking place? So one of them, of course, was industrialization, which leads to a huge population boom, which leads to urbanization. So these things are all kind of part of that. One of the things was with all of these here was that you had rapid growth, and not just rapid growth alone, but what this meant is that the systems in the cities could not keep up. And so what that means is, like, the water services, garbage services, sewer systems, and things like that really just could not keep pace with the rapid growth of population boom and increases in people living in these urban centers because of industrialization, right? It just created this massive influx of people moving into the cities. And this creates problems, of course, because you have another thing that you have with this is not enough housing and not enough, we'll say, public systems. So that's what I'm talking about with, like, the garbage system, sewer system, things like that. So you're going to get these tenements that are for the lower classes that just are really kind of poor condition, that they can't keep up with managing a really unlivable conditions. And so the progressive era is going to talk about and push for reform movements to do this. This also leads to another one, if we put it down here with this, which is political corruption. The same kind of thing, right? Rapid growth, increase in immigration, and this leads to local businesses and individual kind of big bosses, as they end up being called, or are the political machines that are going to take advantage of the kind of lack of systems in place to deal with this massive influx, and or they're going to be in charge for a while. And one of the reform movements is going to be to target political corruption. On top of this, right, you had 1890s depressions and populist movement, which spurred on a push for reform. And then technological changes. There were so many things that were developing during this time. One of the things that I think is a good example of this technological change is the Chicago World's Fair. And there's a book. It's called, I'll put it up here, Devil in the White City. And it's amazing. This book, so what it does is it's all historical, but it feels like fiction, and it parallels the development and problems and issues of, and also just the what took place with the Chicago's World Fair, with one of what's often considered the first American serial killer, H.H. Holmes, who used the changes in women's independence in the World's Fair to set up a Chicago World's Fair hotel right on the edge. He got lucky with his purchase of where he acquired this property that ended up being around the edge of the World's Fair, and created and built it with secret vents and rooms to murder women. As well as a few other people before that, but that was his probably most prolific period. So the story parallels like the Chicago's World's Fair and them doing that. Like the Ferris wheel was created for the World's Fair. There was always supposed to be like one kind of iconic structure. The Eiffel Tower was with the Paris World's Fair. So Chicago wanted to do something big like that, but they obviously didn't want to just build another tower. So they came up with a Ferris wheel. Everyone thought this thing was going to like fall down. It wouldn't support itself, and it did. It's not like the ones if you go to the fair today. They were larger enclosed carriage spaces, and it moved really slowly, like to the point you could like have dinner or like a snack or meal as it went around. So a little bit different than like the typical fair ones today, but those are come from this original version, right? So that was created for the World's Fair. The World's Fair, this went on for a while, and it certainly had issues with some racism and views of civilization, meaning technologically advanced, and seeing anyone that wasn't as uncivilized. But it was meant to put on this impressive display of technological advancement and society and culture of Western civilization. And it had to be a super impressive sight to go to these world fairs. Just all the stuff that they did. And Chicago wanted to show electric lights for the first time, and why it's called the White City. They ran out of time, so they had to just paint all the buildings white. So that's why it got called the White City. But what they did show through that was a city that could be cleaner instead of the gas lights that left, residue and stuff like that, and the kind of like smoke and stuff. You have this city that is powered by electric lights, and the future of that, which of course everyone switched to. And so you kind of had that marvel of that, plus other technological changes and advancements and showcasing this off. And then, of course, there was the development of, I think this is a great picture because you can see the horses, the trolleys, the cars, all in the same cramped space. That this was this transition period of old and new, right? The horses and the carriages with now the trolleys and the cars, and this transition to technology that, of course, provides both positive and negative aspects. So that's kind of the intro to the Progressive Era and the things that are going on with that. So there's certain themes with the Progressive Era that I want to look at. So the first is anger over excess and industrial capitalism and urban growth, right? And obviously with this one, which we kind of just talked about, part of this is because this was seen as the issue of societal and political problems, right? This was the root issue of industrialization, capitalism, urban growth had created the societal and political problems, as well as poor working conditions. And so that there was frustration with this transition, as much as it was liked and appreciated, that you also had the issue of the problems that it created. The second theme was this that it emphasized social cohesion and common bonds among people to solve problems. So this was somewhat of a rejecting the individual spirit. That this had there had been this kind of belief and transition that with if we move up here for a second, with industrialization, right, that equaled individualization. And now everyone was out for themselves. So here, individualization, there we go. So that everyone was only looking out for themselves. They were not looking for the common good. And so there had finally come to kind of push a shift to rejecting that. There was another big thing, was the shift on views of the poor. So traditionally, the old way was like social Darwinism, that the poor were lazy and had all these vices, and they were poor because they, lacked working hard and making their own good choices with that. And the new view was that poor was a reflection on societal problems and infrastructure. And then that instead of the individual, society and changing society needed to happen, right? So instead of the poor person as the problem, right, it was society as the problem. And this is going to lead to a lot of the social reform that is going to get put in there. Settlement houses, pushing for changes on services, development of parks and other things like that, because there was a recognition that it's not just it's not the true issue of saying that the people are poor because they're lazy, right? Because they have vices, because they've made poor life choices. To say, no, we should be looking at what's going on with society, the structure of the cities, the nature of everything around us to create such a situation for the poor, and how can we change that to mitigate that. And so it's a huge social shift. Like, I can't emphasize enough how much of a social shift that was from going from viewing it in the kind of social Darwinism view to this new structure. Then next was the need for citizens to intervene morally and politically in an active way. This very much is connected to muckraking, which we'll talk about, which is essentially expose journalism. The idea of shocking people with the corruption, with like with Jacob Riss, how the other half lives, how the conditions of the poor, and into action. And also an expectation that people have a responsibility to get involved. Right? And we saw some of this, like the gospel of wealth, but not to this extreme. The gospel of wealth was very much just, if you have money, you have an obligation, a responsibility to spend it on things that will help society. And certainly some of the other reform of the Gilded Age does look at this kind of sense of obligation to it, but it definitely was a whole new heightened sense of the belief that people had a moral obligation to get involved, and that they needed to create like public outrage to move towards civic action. And then lastly, the last theme, women's pursuit of independent lives and political reform. Right, if you look at kind of like the old way of how women lived, right, they lived at home, with parents and then got married and lived with husband, right? And kids and everything like that. The new way with the independence was that they might live on their own for a bit before getting married. And that meant, right, working, living with other women, being independent, which was, a significant aspect of that. The other thing was college education, which we're going to look at. And this was not without pushback. There was definitely pushback for women in college education. Professional lives, right, the working component, college education, and then of course leadership in like liberal causes, voting, the push for voting, which we're going to talk about more in its own lecture. Political reform, and sexual rights. So there's a whole lot of reform movement for women because of the shift to independence, because of college education, because of the push for voting, all significant change for women, and also women's involvement independently of their husband or not even having a husband during this time. So these are the major themes of the progressive era. And then we have, if we're looking at it in a larger sense, the changing role of women, right? And we're going to talk about, I mentioned a couple in the themes and stuff like that. But what was changing and stuff like this? So I mentioned reason for change was certainly college education. That was a big one. And this had started to open up to women at the end of the Civil War, slowly, right? That you actually had like Oberlin College, some of the earliest colleges. Oberlin College was one of the first to allow women into the college. Vassar College is the most probably well known for, that was an all women's college, and looked to provide degrees, any degree that women wanted, right? Oberlin College they just had women's courses, and they actually straight up said, like, we're bringing women in to civilize the men. Basically, our young boys are too rowdy and we need women to provide a civilizing force. We don't actually want them to really get any kind of real degree, so we'll just create these women's courses for them. But Vassar College opened up and said women should be able to come through the front door and take any degree, get any degree that a man can get. And then this expanded from there, and then you get to coeducation, and lots of colleges and degrees. This also led to debates on women in college, and this included whether women should be in colleges with only women or whether there should be co-education. But another one was even that this brought up this idea that college for women was somehow detrimental to their health. And we're going to take a look at that with Miss D and Miss E. All right, so let's pull that up here. So Dr. Clark was this doctor that wrote against women in college, and he has lots to say. And this is a specific one where and it says here with this, right? And I have some of this underlined here with this. So I'll just he declared that higher education posed grave dangers for young women students, and this led to a massive controversy and discussions about whether women should be in college or not. And there were lots of responses. After we look over this, I'll tell you some of the clever responses, because many women that were in college wrote, because this got put into like magazines, and so people were talking about it. I think it was in a newspaper too, and many women ended up writing into the newspaper, to the magazines that were in college, and be like, this is utter crap. Like, let me explain what's really causing any kind of physical problem. And we'll see just by looking at it that there clearly are obvious like issues with his conclusions here. But it brings up the point of that there was resistance. As much as women's roles changed during the progressive era, there was, and we'll see this with the suffrage movement too when we talk about that, there is still massive resistance to these changes, including women going to college. And then you had stuff like this that came out that then led to pushback that women then had to defend against, to say, no, this is not true, and because of course it did. It scared people, it scared parents, kind of created that hysteria around that. And so specifically it mentions here that it says that the rigors of higher learning threatened female reproductive capacity. So that's what he's going to argue, is basically you can either go to college and learn and train and improve your mind, or you can nurture your reproductive side and have children, which of course was a very targeted thing to this fear of that women, their role, which is still, even with women becoming independent, going to college, getting degrees, having professional jobs before getting married. There's this fear, and we'll see it all the way through the World War II, that there's this fear of women losing their domesticity, that they won't be domestic anymore, that they won't want to get married, that they won't want to have children. So to put in this fear of, not only can women not want to have kids anymore or be domestic, now they can't. They're giving that up completely. That was a whole, it was a targeted hit on that. So let's look at this. So there's two examples of these two women that he says that, that came to him, and then he gets to his conclusion. So Miss D entered Vassar College at age 14, and they definitely, obviously, there's now students entering community college with the dual enrollment programs again at a younger age. But this was a normal age for people to go into college. 15 to 16 was very normal college age for students back at this point in time. That later gets pushed to 18, because high school gets expanded. So Miss D enters Vassar College at the age of 14. Up to that age, she had been a healthy girl, judged by the standard of American girls, right? So she's saying, like, before college, she was perfectly healthy. She performed all her college duties regularly and steadily. She studied, recited, stood at the blackboard, walked, and went through her gymnastic exercises from the beginning to the end of the term, just as boys do. And he emphasized that, right? Her account of her regimen there was so nearly that of a boy's regimen that it would puzzle a physiologist to determine from the account alone whether the subject of it was male or female. So this is intentionally emphasized. She did exactly what the boys did. And just from, if you didn't see her and you just read these two accounts, you wouldn't know if this was a boy or a girl, taking college courses, which was the point of Vassar College anyway. Like, that was the whole point of Vassar College, which is where she is attending. But, he's making that a big deal out of this. Her first warning was fainting away while exercising in the gymnasium at a time when she should have been comparatively quiet, both mentally and physically. So what does that mean? Why would it be a time that she should be quiet physically and mentally? Well, it's saying because she was on her period, right? So she was on her period. He's saying, oh, she shouldn't have been exercising. She should have been. And again, interesting that to be if you're on your period, apparently you're supposed to be quiet mentally and physically, not just because of cramps or something like that. No, you mentally need to prepare yourself and be quiet. And yes, obviously some people have to lay down because of the pain, but like it has nothing to do with a mental capacity. In her junior year, the organism's periodical function began to perform with pain, moderate at first, but more and more severe with each recurring month. So again, the period I love the descriptions of like women's like body and function. This is why Margaret Sanger is going to write a pamphlet called "What Every Woman Should Know About Their Body," because this is how they described a woman's period. The organism's periodical function, right? Then there's other crazy names for it, but that's one of them, right? So they don't, instead of just saying period or, I don't know, menstruation, it's women's organism's periodical function. And so they say, right, that this led to, she has all this pain and stuff with that. She graduated before 19 with fair honors and a poor physique. So again, yes, she graduated, but now she's in poor health. It says she was by the year succeeding her graduation was one of steadily advancing invalidism. So the year after she graduated, she got worse and worse. She was tortured for 2 or 3 days out of every month, and for 2 or 3 days after each season of torture was weak and miserable, so that about 1/6 or 1/5 of her time was consumed in this way. At the same time, she became pale, hysterical, nervous in the ordinary sense, and almost constantly complained of a headache. I think it's important to note that this idea of hysterical and nervousness, especially hysterical, is definitely always targeted at women. That was weird. Try that again. They didn't use hysterical, and even to this day, hysterical tends to be a word that's a feminine word, and that women are described as hysterical. Rarely are men described as hysterical. It is more insidious at this time. It's still a negative thing today. It was way more insidious at this time because it led to lobotomies, that women were branded hysterical, and they people, husbands and families had their wives and daughters lobotomized, which is crazy. It had them having surgeries to remove their not just to remove their ovaries, and sometimes even larger parts of organs, unnecessarily so. And sometimes shock treatment was also given for hysteria. And sometimes this hysteria, as it was called, was simply for being unhappy in a certain situation with life, right? Okay, it's reasonable that someone would be upset and emotional because they're in constant pain. But instead of saying, oh, look, this person is in constant pain, and so obviously she's upset. No, she's hysterical because she's in pain, right? So, and then that leads to, both of these girls are gonna get committed to insane asylums, basically. And it certainly is used to justify that action. And so it says that physicians tried drugs, but that didn't do much. She was brought to Boston for advice. She presented no evidence of local uterine congestion, inflammation, or so whatever. The evidence was altogether in favor of arrest of development of the reproductive apparatus at a stage when the development was nearly complete. So again, it's described as the reproductive apparatus. Again, weird. They just can't say normal words for them. But what it's saying here, this arrest of development of the reproductive apparatus at a stage when development was nearly complete. They're basically saying, oh, when she was basically going through puberty and starting to get these developing with her period and maturity, that something arrested the development of that, stopped or interrupted the proper development of those functions, if you will, which he's going to blame college for. Sorry, coffee. I was going to pause it, and then I didn't get to it in time. Right, so then it says the case needs very little comment. Its teachings are obvious. Miss D went to college in good physical condition. During the 4 years of her college life, her parents and the college faculty required her to get what is properly called an education. That's funny. She went to college and she had to get an education. Nature required her during the same period to build and put working order a large and complicated reproductive mechanism, a matter that is properly ignored. Shoved out of sight like a disgrace. She naturally obeyed the requirements of the faculty, which she could see, rather than the requirements of the mechanism within her, and she could not see. Subjected to the college regimen, she worked 4 years in getting a liberal education. Notice it calls it liberal education. Her way of work was sustained and continuous and out of harmony with the rhythmical periodicity of the female organism. Again, this idea that if you're working, you can't work through. Basically, if you have your period, when you have your period, you shouldn't be doing anything else. That's basically what he's saying here. Like, you should not be working, you should not be doing anything else because your body demands that you stop. The stream of vital and constructive forces evolved within her was turned steadily to the brain, away from the ovaries and their accessories, which I also think is a funny word. So your ovaries and accessories. The result of this sort of education was that these last mentioned organs, deprived of sufficient opportunity and nurturement, first began to perform their functions with a pain, a warning that was unheeded, and then to cease to grow. Next, to step up once a month, a grumbling torture that made life miserable. And lastly, the brain and whole nervous system disturbed in obedience to the law that if one member suffers, all members suffers, became neurologic and hysterical. So what he's saying here, there's a lot going on there, but what he's basically saying there is that because she decided to nurture her brain, she deprived her body from developing and functioning properly with specifically a woman's body with her period and reproductive organs. And so that shriveled up and caused problems and failed to develop properly because she was spending all her time developing her brain. He's basically saying that you cannot educate your brain and learn and work and go to college without destroying your reproductive organs, essentially. So he's basically saying it's either one or the other. Yes, you can nurture your brain, although actually he's saying no, because he's then claiming that because she deprived her body and the rest and the focus and quiet that the body requires during your period and development of reproductive organs and puberty, and while nurturing her brain, that not only deteriorated and shriveled up those, but then eventually led to her becoming hysterical and damaging her brain. So you're kind of screwed, basically. You know, it's not actually one or the other. It can't be one or the other initially, but then it's going to go back to your brain anyway. So he's basically saying women can't go to college because if they do, with the rigors of the school, they won't develop properly through puberty and through reproductive organs and all of this, and that will cause pain and suffering, which will eventually lead to the deterioration of your brain, which will lead to hysteria, right? And then it says that, right, that they were surprised at this. And he says on both of them that I finally obliged to consign her to an asylum. So he ends up like basically saying, yeah, these women had to go to an asylum because they went crazy because they were trying to improve their brain when they should have been focusing on their body. Miss E, same kind of thing. Her father was one of our ripest and broadest American scholars, and her mother was one of our most accomplished American women. They both enjoyed excellent health. Their daughter had a literary training in intellectual, moral, and aesthetic half of education, such as their supervision would likely to give, and one that few women of her age received. Her health did not seem to suffer at first. She studied, she recited, walked, worked, stood in a steady and sustained way that is normal to the male organization. She seemed to evolve force enough to acquire a number of languages, to become familiar with the natural sciences, and to take hold of philosophy and mathematics, and to keep in good physical case while doing all this. However, at the age of 21, she might have been presented to the public on commencement day by the president of Vassar College. Right, with all this. But what happens is that the function began to show signs of failure of power. No severe or even moderate illness overtook her. She was subjected to no unusual strain. She was only following the regime and continued and sustained work regardless of nature's periodical demands for a portion of her time and force when, without any apparent cause, the failure of power was manifested by moderate dysmenorrhea and diminished excretion. Soon after the function ceased altogether, her period. So, it's saying her period stopped. That. She was fine. She managed to go through all this college and learn all this stuff, and then all of a sudden her period stopped. And then up to this present writing, a period of 6 to 8 years, it has shown no more signs of activity than an amputated arm. So he's basically saying it stopped and then has not come back after 6 to 8 years. In the course of a year or so after the cessation of the function, her head began to trouble her. There's the brain again. There was a headache and a frequent congested condition, which she described as a rush of blood to her head, which led to feelings of despondence. Then her mental state, her skin became rough and coarse. Acne covered her face. She retained her appetite and ability to exercise and sleep. A careful examination of her pelvic organs by an expert disclosed no lesion or displacement there, no ovaritis or inflammation. So basically they couldn't find anything physically wrong with her, but he was finally obliged to consign her to an asylum. So I think this is a really good example, though, of how college education was attacked for women. And sure, you had debates, coeducation's better, all women's college is better, but then you have this very damaging writing by this so-called doctor that's claiming that these young girls were of perfect health until they went to college and nurtured their brain over their bodies like they should be doing, and that this then not only causes deterioration of the body and, of course, more like alarming to society at the time, their period and their ability to have children. And then this led to their mental decline, which led them to being put to an asylum, right? It was a fear-mongering about women being educated, right? So but what also, of course, took place is that the shift to college education led to, as much as you had these debates, right, there was positives to it. It wasn't only negative, right? It led to more women working. It led to more women having degrees. It led to more middle-class women. We'll see in this with the Progressive Era, one of the biggest things that it did is it also led to women working outside of the home before getting married. Other reasons for change for women was immigrant and poor women outside of the Victorian expectation. There was an increasing, working and poor class that had never been part of the traditional Victorian expectation of women staying at home and having children and not doing anything else. And then you also have the rise of professional women because of college education and this sense of, along with, of course, domestic work, shifting domestic work to factory work. I think both of these things, right, led to a heightened sense of economic independence. And this is where we get when we look at, let's go back here to Women in Economics with this reading, which was Charlotte Perkins Gilman, Women and Economics, which she is actually talking about women had a desire and wanted to be independent, wanted to work, right? And finally were able to express this, especially for the middle class, because we looked at the cult of domesticity in the middle class. And again, immigrants and lower class women had always been outside of that expectation that you got married and you stayed at home and you didn't work because out of necessity for survival. But now you had a new middle class that wanted to do more than just stay at home. They wanted to expand the cult of domesticity outside of the home. And so we have this writing that talks about the working woman and the working professional, and seeing this, as it says here, it became a symbol of female emancipation, that women experienced not fulfillment but oppression at the home, and housewife was an unproductive parasite, little more than a servant to her husband and children. And this certainly moves towards women in the suffrage movement of this push for that change, right? And so she says it's not motherhood that keeps the housewife on her feet from dawn till dusk. It's the house service, not child service. So she does say, right, it's not a problem with kids, right? It's housework. It's all the chores of cleaning and cooking and doing all of that domestic work, right? Women work longer and harder than most men and not solely in maternal duties. The savage mother carries the burdens and does all the menial services for the tribe. Many mothers, even now, are wage earners for the family as well, and the bearers and rearers of it. And right, this double duty, right, that they're working both at home and at work, and having to not only go work, especially lower classes where that you weren't expected to quit when you had kids, that they had to go to work, and then they also had to take care of the home, and that it was expected that women would clean, would cook, would raise the children, and that this is what is causing, like, not only like putting women down, but causing women to be unhappy. A truer spirit of increasing desire of young girls is to be independent, to have a career of their own, at least for a while, and the growing objection of countless wives to the pitiful asking for money, to the beggary of their position. So even this recognition in this, that women don't want to be beholden to their husbands for money. They want to have some independence, and the way to do that is through not only education, but work. Right? Economic independence for women necessarily involves change in the home and family relation. But if that change is for the advantage of an individual and race, we need not fear it. It does not involve change in the marriage relation except in withdrawing the element of economic dependence, nor in the relation of mother to child, save to improve it. So she's trying to assuage people's fears. This does not mean that doing this is going to cause a break in marriage, or that this is going to hurt the mother-child relationship. No, this will make it better because women will be happier and will feel more empowered, right? And because it was a real big thing when people say, oh, women want to go out and work, they want to do this, oh, it's going to ruin the family, it's going to ruin the marriage, it's going to ruin motherhood. And they're like, no, it doesn't. It doesn't at all, and only improves things. So, in this, right, she's trying to say this idea of that not only do women want to be independent, not only do women want to have options to work, to make money, but that this ultimately improves not only women's lives, but their marriage and as mothers as well. But she does say, right, this does require that there's an introduction to some other form of living than which now obtains. It will render impossible the present method of feeding the world by means of millions of private servants and bringing up children by the same hand. So it's saying, like, the society has to be willing, and actually probably the husband has to be willing to make some changes in the home, because women can't do all this and still clean and cook all the time and take care of the children all the time, right? That there needs to be some give in that. But that ultimately this will be better if women are no longer what she calls domestic servants by trade, and instead have that independence in their life. So once again, it's just another source that shows this desire for economic independence, and that goal, right? This, and then with the also changes for women's work, you also have just more jobs, professional jobs, because of college education, clerical work, a later telephone operator. Women are going to get degrees in medicine and as a lawyer, although many will still not be able to practice that yet outside of nursing. But you certainly see, social work is going to be a huge one. Clerical work is definitely one that becomes acceptable. The lawyer and doctor are still kind of out of reach, but women do start getting degrees because they want to do that. It's just not gonna, they're gonna find it harder to be able to get jobs in that yet. This also, of course, one of the other things is you get mixed interactions with work, right? So women talking with men, men getting to see women work, which provides additional independence and change in the view of women, which is going to help with the suffrage movement. All right, and then socially, one of the things that takes place socially that's on here is shrinking families and waiting to get married until older. So women, because they started to go to college and then they wanted, the middle class, even though the one we just looked at is with Charlotte, is promoting this idea that women should be able to be married and work and have that independence. It still was a huge push and expectation that if you were in the middle class, women, if they were working, would stop once they got married. So many women decided that instead of getting married right away, they would go to college, they would work, and they would get married later so they could work for a while in the degree that they obtained, and because they wanted to work, because they wanted that independence. And so you have less kids, you have waiting longer to get married. You're also going to have what's somewhat seen as one of the earlier sexual revolutions, in a couple ways. One, of course, is with Margaret Sanger, What Every Woman Should Know or Ought to Know. This was a pamphlet that was created that was meant to educate women about their bodies, because people, I mean, we just read the Dr. Clark and how he talked about the period and puberty and the awkward ways of phrasing it. Even within the home, mothers to daughters would whisper things and not tell their daughters about what to expect. One of the things Margaret Sanger would say is it's horrible that girls would wake up one day bleeding and think they were dying because no one mentioned to them about their period and what happens with puberty. And so that this needed to change. People it needed to be socially acceptable to talk about these things with women, with young girls with women, because it was seen as not proper and you weren't supposed to talk about these things. And so she wanted everyone to know things like with the period, STDs, general functions of the body. Right, this is what her pamphlets, each time she sent out, I think it was a monthly pamphlet, there'd be one of these topics. Now, one of the problems that comes with this is the post office, interestingly enough, was in charge of censoring material that was sent through the mail. So if there was stuff that was deemed inappropriate, and they, when she did the one about STDs, decided that it was inappropriate, and they censored her pamphlet. So she got really upset and she sent out a new pamphlet the next day that said what every woman should know, and then it's completely blank and it says nothing by order of the post office. So she sent out this blank pamphlet with just that basically that title, what every woman should know, nothing by order of the post office. And it was to make a point that we're now being prevented from sharing stuff for women to know from the post office. She not only faced resistance with this, but she also was, one of the other things that Margaret Sanger was very much known for was birth control. And her belief that women should have access to birth control because having 13, 14 children was not only physically damaging to the body, but also then was super limiting to women. Because if women in lower classes and poorer conditions having more and more children just made sure you stayed in that economic position. It also gave women less choice on what they wanted to do. It also, of course, meant that the whole focus on sex was about reproduction and having children, which it largely was. And there was a huge push, not just by Margaret Sanger, but by others, that sex should be more than just about children, that women can enjoy sex. That it's not just for reproduction. She ended up opening up a birth control clinic, and there was a line around the block for women eager to have birth control because they didn't want to keep having children, or they at least wanted to be able to control when they had kids. Within 72 hours, she was shut down and arrested under the Comstock Act, Right, and we talked about this act before. The Comstock Act was a decency law. It was supposed to be both for men and women. It didn't matter. There was no gender specific rule with this, but it was an indecency law. Of course, almost exclusively women were charged with the Comstock Act. Almost never were men charged with the Comstock Act. And so she was arrested for under the Comstock Act for this. She didn't stop trying to promote the need for birth control. But her birth control clinic access was thwarted with this, but she continued to post and write about the importance and need for women to have access to birth control. Interestingly, that does not become socially acceptable until the Great Depression. And the reason is, of course, because the Great Depression made it clear that no one could afford to deal with extra children at this point. So it took the act of the Great Depression to make birth control socially acceptable. And then just that, again, that with this idea that women could enjoy sex, it wasn't just for children. This was a brand new kind of view. Traditionally, it was seen that women did not enjoy sex or want it. And this goes all the way back to the Revolutionary War, where the view of women shifted to women were virtuous and almost asexual, and so they needed to be protected from men who were overly sexual, which had been a reverse, because before the Revolutionary War, women were the sexual beings, but it had shifted during this period. And one of the ways this is most shown, not that women could have sex and enjoy it, but that women shouldn't, that they didn't want to enjoy it, is that for a period of time, doctors would come with chloroform, and they would knock women out at their home. They make home visits a couple of times a week so their husbands could have sex with them while they were knocked out. I mean, how much more, like, not only is that dangerous to your health, but like it also showcases this idea, oh, well, women, they were more aware of this, like they weren't knocking them out and she didn't know. But again, this was perpetuated by this idea that women don't want sex, they don't enjoy sex, so better just to knock them out and make them unconscious. It's because their husbands want to have sex. Like a crazy view, right? And so it was a shifting paradigm that this was not true. And it didn't have to just be for procreation, and women could enjoy this as well. All right, so one of the big, I think, examples of changes in how women were part of this reform movement in the progressive era, and then in part because of their college education as nurses and social work, which was very much part of this, were the settlement houses. And so it both targets, like I said, women in college education, specifically with, and the connection to cult of domesticity, social work, and then nursing, both of these aspects. But I'll talk more about the connection to cult of domesticity in just a minute. But the settlement houses, and then the other part was, so let me put one here, and then two was the reform views on the poor, right? That things needed to change in society, not just that poor people were lazy and had vices, but instead that there needed to be active involvement of people in pushing for and looking for reform and changes. And so several women began to look to this to create settlement houses for the poor, specifically poor women and children, because there kind of still was an expectation that women would help serve women and children, not always men. And so what they did is they created these homes in poor areas, and these were run by young college-educated women, and importantly, women lived in the homes and worked with the women and children. This was a whole new thing. Under the cult of domesticity, one of the expansions that took place was first motherhood, and then it expanded to social work and taking care of the poor. But back then, that meant middle-class women going into poor areas and handing out stuff or providing, resources, and then going back home to their, homes in the middle-class area. This was a whole kind of revolutionary idea to actually live and work with the lower classes where poor people lived. They went to the tenements in those areas, and they built these homes to help provide specifically health care and support services that were desperately needed in these areas. So again, largely healthcare and classes. They did push reform movements on that. It is going to expand depending on the settlement house. Each settlement house did different things slightly. Healthcare, though, for women and children was always a central feature of all the settlement houses. Now, just to give you an idea of this rapid growth of settlement houses in the progressive era, here's the timeline. In 1874, 6 settlement houses. 1891, 74 settlement houses. 1900, 200 settlement houses, and by 1910, over 400 settlement houses. So this rapid growth of settlement houses during this period in time, because of the need and women wanting to get involved and help push for this reform movement. So 2 of the biggest and well-known settlement houses were Henry Street Settlement and then the Hull House. Henry Street Settlement was started by Lillian Wald, and the Hull House was started by Jane Addams. So we're going to talk about both of those. So the Henry Street Settlement, as I mentioned, was set up by Lillian Wald. She had her first experiences as a visiting nurse before she set up the Henry Street Settlement. One of her first experiences as a visiting nurse that she wrote about later, that she said caused her to want to create the settlement house, was that as she was going around helping people, this young child came up to her, kind of tugged on her skirt, and just kept repeating, mother, baby, blood, mother, baby, blood. So she ended up following the girl to one of the homes in the tenement, where this woman in a filthy, she described it as like this filthy home with rats scurrying about on a dirty mattress, was in the middle of giving birth and bleeding, and the doctor had left her in the middle of this because she could not pay. And she said that this was like her trial by fire, and she realized this immediate need that became a thing, not only of the Henry Street Settlement, but most of the settlement houses, to not turn away people because they could not pay. She was just, just outraged that the doctor had left in the middle of this woman having a difficult birth because they couldn't afford to pay. She ended up taking anything, any amount that people could afford. If they couldn't afford anything, then that's fine. If they wanted to give something, like goods, which was often the case, that was fine too. It didn't matter. Whatever you could afford to pay or give, and if you couldn't, that you still would not be turned away. She ended up helping this woman, but it led to her setting up the Henry Street Settlement, which not only provided nursing services and stuff, she still continued the nursing component, but also was about teaching proper health and sanitation, because she saw that as one of the biggest issues with a lot of the health problems, was the lack of proper health and sanitation. Now, some of that was just definitely to the structure of the tenement houses, but also some of it was the education. And so it provided this vital need for resources for people to come stay, to come get classes, to come show up and get health care whenever they needed. Jane Addams, with the Hull House, was also about providing health care and classes, but she expanded to a boarding house for women and children. She created a daycare and a kindergarten, and then also, which some of this, not the protest and political reform, but the art gallery, library, music school, and stuff like that. This here definitely feels somewhat like the social gospel, in that there should be these options for it. But she saw it as like, the lower classes should not be denied access to these educational and just cultural experiences because they're lower class. And so she incorporated that, which is why Jane Addams' Hull House was very unique, because she didn't just focus on like healthcare and nursing and classes, but provided a daycare, a kindergarten, a boarding house for women and children that needed it, the library, art gallery, music school. She also provided stores with essentially discounted food for those who couldn't afford it at the traditional stores, and also was very much involved in protest and political reform. Looking to, of course, change a lot of the policies for the local politicians, government policies for water and sewage. She also was on strikes, pushed for strikes for labor rights, also child workers, and wanting to end that. And then, of course, was a huge on voting for women. So there was this whole political structure as well as the healthcare and aspect of that. So I think the Hull House, the best example of the Hull House is that it was much more expansive than a lot of the other settlement houses. So this was a really important. This provided massive services for the lower classes that had been in the past not available to them, and the fact that women went and lived in these homes. They lived in the settlement homes. They didn't live somewhere else and come to work every day. Their work was their home, and this allowed them to get to know the people around them, to have people trust them, to be able to provide the services and care that was otherwise really not available to them before this, while also, in the case of Jane Addams and others that joined in as well, being politically active and pushing for change and political reform to make conditions and laws and services available outside of what just they were doing. Because, of course, their argument was, we shouldn't be the only ones providing this. This should be part of the government initiative to help to make change, to reduce the number of poor and bad conditions and issues within society. Now, one of the other ways that there was a push for change and trying to make reform within society was called muckraking, which was essentially expose literature. And as is mentioned here, the goal was to expose corruption and shock people into action. Right, it was like, yeah, we can do protests, we can do strikes, we can try to make changes and stuff like that. But ultimately, like, how do we get people to care? And one of the ways was this shock, exposure, to make people be shocked into action, to be so either offended or concerned by what they were presented with, that they now feel like they must act. And so this took place both in political and social reform, in looking at political corruption and social change. Jacob Riis' How the Other Half Lives was about the social reform. I mean, it's political too, because it's with the poor. He was one of the first to really use images to provoke emotion and change. You know the whole saying, like, an image is worth 1,000 words. It was this idea of, right, the power of pictures. He said, I can write all day long about the conditions in the tenement homes, and which the tenements were basically slums in many cases. They were, originally buildings that were meant for a smaller number of people, or were even sometimes single family homes that had been converted into many apartments. And the problem with this, of course, is that the building conditions were poor. It was definitely a fire hazard. The inside apartments didn't even have windows because of how they divided up these single units into multi-unit apartments. So some families had no circulation or air circulation coming through. There certainly wasn't central air or heat. Because they had no windows. If you were on the outside apartments, then at least you got a window, but those cost more than the inside ones. Again, there was no building code, followed with this. There was no garbage or sewage issues. Women just dumped out garbage and chamber pots outside of the windows. So this created disease and problems as well. So these and then there was a huge problem with overcrowding. Poor conditions. So what he did is he said, as much as I can write about all of these problems that are taking place in the tenements, people aren't going to understand or feel the issues, right, until they see it. And the reality is that many of the wealthy, even though they didn't live that far away from these tenements, they never went into that part of town. And while the poor walked past these wealthy mansions from the Gilded Age all the time, the lower classes didn't go. I mean, the wealthy didn't go into the lower classes area. And so they didn't see the horrible conditions that existed. And so these pictures not only highlighted and showed these horrible conditions, but also, provided access into that life that they otherwise didn't realize, somewhat out of ignorance, that was taking place. And it was an incredibly successful campaign in shocking the wealthy into realizing how horrible conditions were in these tenements and pushing them to make political change, to push for reform that had otherwise largely been ignored up until that point. Like how overcrowded, you would have 2-bedroom apartments with 7 people in the family living in these 2-bedroom apartments plus 2 boarders, because a lot of times families couldn't afford just to live there on their own, so they would take in single men that were boarders, who would pay a little bit of rent to help cut the cost. So you would have like 9 people in a 2-bedroom house. The conditions were extremely cramped and horrible. The streets were dirty and filthy. There's one of the pictures of like a kid's hanging out right next to a horse that's dead on the street and decaying. Children sleeping on the street because they were homeless or didn't want to go home. Homes that are incredibly cramped and in poor condition. And again, it shocked people into to realize, not only being aware and realizing the conditions, but making change. Others that then kind of took up this mantle, McClure's Magazine was a monthly magazine, and it wasn't just muckraking. It had elements of muckraking in the magazine. So the magazine also had like popular fiction stories, things about travel, science and technology, history and news. And then they also had photographs and illustrations that focused on urban middle class and nation societal problems. And so they basically, the McClure's Magazine was a mix of like, your regular magazine for all these things and muckraking. There was always an muckraking article or two in the magazine, along with all these other ones. But McClure's Magazine was certainly popular, and it was actually started and run by a woman. So that wanted to provide not only information to people and stories and information, but then also have that expose journalism as well. And then you also had Lincoln Stephan, who A Shame of the Cities, and his focused on showing urban politics and the corruption and on big bosses and the graft that was taking place in local politics. So his goal was to, this was a lot of the idea was the scandal, showcase and bring to light the scandal of certain politicians that would force them to resign, or at least have more people protesting against them. Now, muckraking did lead to the development of paparazzi, which is definitely was no longer about shock and exposure for reform and change, and paparazzi were just about trying to shock and expose for scandal because it was salacious and people wanted to read it. So it certainly like some of the benefits of and good intentions of early muckraking eventually lead to the not so good of paparazzi, where it's just looking to demean people and call out scandals or whatever behavior someone might be like, tisk tisk to. But the original point was based on this goal of reform and change. Another type of reform during the progressive era was intellectual movements and trends and education, and actually several other areas. Education was a big one, right? There was others though. There was definitely changes in law, the economic structure of things, and social sciences. In how people looked at sociology, psychology, and anthropology. So a lot of the actually kind of modern day view of these areas, the kind of origins of today's views, and we'll say processes come from the reform movement of this time. Lester Frank Ward really did a big push against social Darwinism and trying to combat any of that lingering view of the poor and this idea of survival of the fittest socially, and tried to discredit and downplay that movement. And then John Dewey is probably best known for the educational reform that took place. So his big thing was looking at tackling this. He rejected this memorization of facts. Not complete, like you have to memorize some things, but very like old school tradition of school was, okay, we're going to, like how people learned, like, so you had to take, like a lot of education back in the day, you learned like Greek or Latin for a language. And so how they learned it was they literally would you just write and copy over and over and over again. And this actually went back to like Roman, Greek times where like, actually, no, that's not true. The Mesopotamians, we have cuneiform tablets where the scribes were just learning this by writing over and over again, different like literature and things like that. But like, so one of the ways of viewing memorization was not just like learning the information and then having to study it and memorize it, but like literally just writing it down over and over and over again. So you didn't learn the context, you didn't learn like the reasons behind it. It was just, here's the information, here's the facts, here's the dates, here's the names, here's the information. You're going to write it over and over until you have it memorized, and that's how you learn. The idea that, right, there was no conversation, there was no discussion, there was no involvement of the student outside of sitting there and writing to memorize this information. And he said that defeats the point. Instead, learning should be through active practice and real-world experiences. Creativity and questioning are important and should be part of the student learning process to develop creative intelligence, essentially. And a lot of the, and there's certainly been more reform movements in education since then, but certainly a kind of where some of our educational movements have come to this day have their original roots in the reform in education that took place in the progressive era, with John Dewey being one of the major proponents of this educational change. And it certainly allowed for students to ask questions, to investigate things more, to be more creative in school, to encourage a dialogue and questioning and reading more than just for rote memorization. Some of the criticism against this, of course, is that it was all about trying to prepare people for industrialization with the real world experiences and stuff like that. But it certainly had an important shift from just, here's the information, write it down over and over again until you have it memorized, and we're not going to expand beyond that, and you're not going to be allowed to question anything. It is the way it is because we tell you it is, rather than having you explore and try to read and learn and understand and make connections of why things are important or why they led to things and things like that. And then lastly, we'll look at the urban and political reform. So one of the other issues was urban and political, urban politics, and then the push for reform because of the corruption that took place. So there was this whole organized structure to provide services to new immigrants and businesses as part of political influence by what were called like big bosses, or later also the political machine. And they were kind of, we'll say, like mob bosses. It really does remind me of mob bosses and stuff like this. And this political cartoon is kind of talking about that, right? This both for companies and for politics. They intentionally targeted immigrants when they came in and moved to the city, because of course coming to a new place where you didn't speak the language was intimidating. You didn't know what resources and opportunities were available. All of that, caused, concern and issues. And so they provided this sense of community and like, hey, I'm here to help you. And initially seeming friendly, but getting somewhat forceful and bullying in order to get the votes. They provided protection in the sense of like, I'm going to provide you protection, but you've got to vote for me. But it was this sense of like, you know, hey, I'm protecting you. If I wasn't here, you would be dead, you know, kind of thing. You would be robbed. You would be without this. I helped your family when you first came here in a time of need. You have to support me, kind of thing. Right, and so it was this you know, kind of requirement for votes, but it also included graft, bullying, theft, vandalism, and beatings. You know, if you push back, if you said, I don't need your protection, all of a sudden your store was burned down. If you know, questioned what they did, you could get a visit where you got, you know, threatened or attacked, and they stole. There was many of these politicians that were part of this local system, and this isn't at the federal level. This is at the like state and local level. They had ties to gambling. Here, let me put it here with this. So there were these politicians had ties to gambling, prostitution, entertainment. Right, and I mean, these were illegal, but it made them money, which allowed them to continue being a politician, which, by the way, these big boss of political machines, they weren't in it for the good, not for good of the people, right? They were in it for political power and influence and money. Right, so they could control some of the local laws that helped there. They also had legitimate businesses. And so if they were running stuff, right, they could control the laws that benefited them. But they also were in these illegal businesses as well, which again, mob boss feelings of the gambling and prostitution. Entertainment was to, you know, make people happy, keep people happy. They did provide festivals and other activities for local communities. So it wasn't all bad. There were benefits, but it was so wrapped around this corruption that then also hurt people who pushed back or said, like, wait a minute, or like, I don't agree with your policies. Well, those people then were the ones that experienced a lot of negative consequences. The people who were like, I support you, whatever, you know, you did benefit from this. But anyone who you know, had a different opinion ended up, you know, getting attacked, having their business destroyed or vandalized, getting beaten up. Notwithstanding the fact that these political figures were completely like falling in this like bullying or gambling and prostitution, illegal businesses to make money, and it really was about the money for them, not the good of the people. So what ends up happening is there's this whole push for a good government movement. The idea that we needed to have a transition to a good government, which meant that local politicians would replace the political machines that were often this mix of business and politician. And that urban political machine would no longer be in place, and it would be individual people that had no ties to the business aspect of it. Because part of the problem was, right, that these were business people that intentionally intertwined business and politics together, and it naturally led to corruption for the sake of money. So if you instead focused on local politicians that were there for the people, not the business, that this would eliminate and prevent some of the graft. Also nonpartisan positions, and this specifically was looking at that they needed to people. So you know, if you did favors for the boss, or you were a friend or whatever, they would put people in positions of like city management and planning, sewage, water plants, and stuff like this. And these would be people that had no education and knowledge in these areas. They would just, you know, did a favor or were a friend of these political entities, and so they got put into these positions. And they said, we need positions that are based on knowledge and education, you know, over partisan politics, and that these positions should be put into positions for the good of the city, not based on who's friends with the politician that knows nothing, because they're screwing us over. And imagine, like I said, city planning with someone who has no concept of what to do and doesn't care. They just got this position. They're getting some money. They're getting some recognition. You know, they don't care if they do a good job. No, there needs to be these positions that are hired in that aren't about partisan politics, and that these are the ones that are for right, the good and function of the city. All right, and then they needed stronger mayoral power because the belief was with a stronger mayoral power, they could appoint and administer civil servants, they could hold people accountable, and would have the power over these urban political machines and big bosses that had come into play in the local level. And then the also was to remove some decisions from the electoral process altogether. There was, right, because there was corruption in certain areas, that it should be removed from the electoral process. Again, in kind of areas of this was in need. This was talked about with the populist movement with the railroads. They actually brought up railroads again and said the railroads shouldn't be part of this political system, city sewer systems, taxes, anything that helped remove the influence of big business, giving money for votes, right, would help benefit the city, because the reality was these businesses were giving money for votes for the benefit of themselves rather than for the benefit of the city. So if you remove some of these positions that people were basically paying money to get from that electoral process, and instead the mayor, who now had stronger power, could put those people into those positions, then this would run smoother and just eliminate that political corruption altogether. The other way to eliminate political corruption was open politics, right? Everything should be visible to the voters, right? Why decisions were being made, policies that were being enacted. Everything was done behind closed doors up to this point. And they said, we need to know what's going on so that we can hold the politicians accountable. So the key with all of this is the Progressive Era was a period of massive reform and change. This eventually leaked into the federal politics, even with the presidential campaign running on a progressive ticket, right? So this didn't just stay within the local urban centers and level. It eventually moved to that you had with Roosevelt and others running a presidential campaign on the progressive values and ideals. So this went all the way up to the federal level eventually, but started locally in the cities. But the Progressive Era was a period of change for lots of people, and especially for women and the poor, but was also a period of reform and pushing back against a lot of the problems that had emerged because of rapid growth, because of industrialization, and pushing back against corruption and trying to make change for the good and better of the people, rather than looking only at individual, like, I need to get mine and screw everyone else kind of policy. So that's where we'll leave it for this one. Again, we will talk about women's suffrage movement in its own separate lecture after World War I.